We are going to be to welcome again to Dear Disney Presents Walt Disney an American Original. Today we're going to be going Section 3, Chapter 11. Walt Disney realized that the creative energies of his young artist could not be satisfied by the grinding out of 8-minute gag-packed cartoons, nor was he content with the repetition of well-worn formulas for familiar characters. Besides, the economic basis for cartoon shorts was deteriorating. Despite the continued popularity of Mickey Mouse and the emergence of new Disney stars, Pluto the ingenious hound who first appeared in a Mickey Mouse, The Chain Gang, in 1930, the affable, dim-witted Goofy who starred in Mickey's Revue in 1932, and the explosive Donald Duck who made his debut in 1934 Silly Symphony, The Wise Little Hen. The Depression had forced the theaters to offer more and more entertainment to allure customers, and exhibitors had adopted the double feature, two full-length films on one bill. That meant there was little left in each theater's budget or running time for short subjects. Despite the fact that Walt Disney cartoons drew more people to the movies than many features, bookings for the cartoons became more difficult. At the same time, the cost of the cartoons continued to climb. Walt had long recognized the inevitability of the cartoon feature. All of his planning had aimed in that direction, developing greater drawing skills with the art school, experimenting with color and photographic innovations, using the silly symphonies as proving ground for the new techniques and themes. In 1934, he decided it was time to move ahead on the features. His decision was unilateral. Roy was acutely aware of the narrowing gap between the cost of cartoons and the fiscal returns, and he was alarmed by Walt's plan to spend perhaps 500,000 on a feature. Lily was apprehensive too, but Walt could not be dissuaded. He could never explain why he had chosen Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the first feature. He liked to recall how he, along with the other Kansas City newsboys, had been invited in 1915 to the silent versions of Snow White, starring Margaret Clark, at the convention. The movie was projected on four screens in the huge auditorium, and from where he was sitting, Walt could watch two of them. One moment. It had been his most vivid early memory of attending the movies, but his choice of Snow White was more pragmatic than sentimental. He recognized it as a splendid tale for animation, containing all the necessary ingredients: an appealing heroine and hero, a villainess of classical proportions, the dwarfs for sympathy and comic relief, a folklore plot that touched the hearts of human beings everywhere. Disney animators first learned of the project one evening when several of them returned from dinner at a cafe across Hyperion Avenue. They found Walt waiting for them, and he said, "Come on in the soundstage. I've got something to tell you." They followed him onto the spare stage, lighted by a single naked bulb, and they took chairs in a semicircle before him. He began to tell them the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as it might be animated on the screen. He acted out each part, his eyebrows ascending as he mixed dreaded potions as the Eva Queen, his face beaming when he depicted the merry dwarfs. The performance took 2 hours, and at the end, when the prince's kiss awakened the sleeping Snow White, there were tears in the eyes of his listeners. "That's going to be our first feature," Walt announced. He began by installing a small unit of storymen and artists in an office adjoining his. By late 1934, Walt's original story had been transferred into an outline of the characters and a suggested plot. Snow White was described in terms of Janet Gaynor, 14 years old, the prince, and 18-year-old Douglas Fairbanks Jr. The queen received the most detailed description. A mixture of Lady Macbeth and the Big Bad Wolf. Her beauty is sinister, mature, plenty of curves. She becomes ugly and menacing when scheming and mixing her poisons. Magic fluids transform her into an old witch like hag. Her dialogue and action are over melodramatic, verging on the ridiculous. Walt recognized from the outset the difficulty of establishing seven dwarves, each with a recognizable and endearing quality. The solution was to name them for their most recognizable characteristics. The outlines listed them, with tentative names for all but one. Happy, a glad boy, sentimental, addicted to happy proverbs. His jaw slips out of its socket when he talks, thus producing a goofy speech mannerism. Sleepy, Sterling Holloway, always going to sleep, always swatting at a fly at the end of his nose. Doc, the leader and spokesman of the dwarves, pompous, wordy, great dignity, feels his superiority, but is more or less of a windbag. Bashful, has a high peaked skull which makes him ashamed to take off his hat, blushing, hesitating, squirmy, giggly. Jumpy, Joe Twerp, like a chap in constant fear of being goosed, nervous, excited, his words and sentences mixed up. Grumpy, typically dyspective and grouch, pessimistic, woman hating, the last to make friends with Snow White. Seventh, deaf, always listening intently, happy, quick movements, spry. Walt worked with the Snow White unit through 1935 while maintaining his supervision of the short cartoons. His seemingly limitless energies again faltered, and he complained of the same lack of concentration that had presaged his nervous breakdown in 1931. A doctor gave him injections for thyroid deficiency, and the treatment seemed to increase his nervousness. Roy perceived the danger signs in his brother, and he suggested, "Why don't we take the girls to Europe for a vacation? It's a 10th wedding anniversary for both of us, and I think Lily and Edna deserve it for putting up with us." Walt agreed, and the four Disneys embarked for a tour of England, France, Switzerland, Italy, and Holland. Walt in later years wrote to a friend about an incident on the trip. "My brother Roy and I were in London prior to going to Paris to receive a medal from the League of Nations for Mickey Mouse. Under much protest, being strictly the sports clothes type myself, we were persuaded to have morning suits made. We were told that other attire would be inappropriate since it was to be in an important occasion with ambassadors and other dignitaries in attendance. The fitting itself was a panic, with Roy's coat on me and mine on him, my pants on Roy and someone else's pants on me. The place was in a turmoil. Anyways, we went to the affair in Paris properly attired, only to find that everyone there had wanted the boys from Hollywood to feel at home, so they came in casual clothes. I haven't had the thing on since." Walt enjoyed driving through the places he had known as a Red Cross driver, including Strasbourg, where he was again fascinated by the mechanical figures that appeared at the striking of the town clock. He tried to gain entrance to the workings of the clock so he could see how it operated, but the local officials wouldn't allow it. Everywhere the Disneys went in Europe, they saw evidence of the appeal of the Disney cartoons. Crowds greeted them at railway stations. Reporters came to the hotels for interviews. In Rome, the Disneys were received by Benito Mussolini in his huge office. For Walt, the most significant part of his European trip was seeing a theater in Paris that played six of his cartoons and nothing else. That convinced him more than ever that audiences would accept and welcome a cartoon the length of a live action feature. After 11 weeks abroad, Walt returned to the studio with renewed energy. When the doctor telephoned to remind him of his thyroid injections, Walt told his secretary, "Tell him I'm cured. He can shoot those things in his own butt from now on." Walt was bristling with ideas after his European trip. He brought with him children's books with illustrations of little people, bees, and small insects, and he told his staff in a memo, "This quaint atmosphere fascinates me, and I was trying to think of how we could build some little story that would incorporate all these little cute little characters." In a long memo to Ted Sears in the story department on the day before Christmas 1935, Walt outlined a score of ideas for future cartoon subjects. Most of them were for silly symphonies, which afforded greater freedom in the choice of story material. But he also had ideas for Mickey Mouse, including a burlesque on Tarzan with Mickey as the ape man, and have him live in the jungle with the wild animals for his friends. Having for the first time seen the cartoons in foreign lands, Walt observed, "The more pictures we can make without dialogue, the better it'll be for our foreign market. We have to depend on the foreign market very strongly now, on account of the necessity of having larger grosses. However, I wouldn't let this stand in the way of any good plot or idea that had dialogue in it. Walt concluded the memo by urging improvements of the story department. Let's not take any Tom, Dick, or Harry that shows up. Let's be very discriminating about it. See if we can't really find someone who has the qualifications. How about this fellow in Portland who sent in the Lion and the Mouse story? Have you heard any more about him? Let's try to make arrangements with the people. Get them in here and let's try them out. I honestly feel that the heart of our organization is the story department. We must have good stories. We must have them worked out. We must have people in there who can not only think up ideas, but who can carry them through and sell them to the people who have to do with the completion of the thing. The only way we can develop the story department is by starting in and trying to find these people. Then we must get them in and try them out. We must try to develop them. If they don't prove up, we just get rid of them before it's too late. We don't want to get the place cluttered up with a lot of people who are only so so. I also feel the story department is one of our weakest spots today when it should be one of our strongest. I think you should make a drive to get more gagmen like Harry Reeves and Roy Williams, men who can really produce something. Only if it is possible, we must get gagmen who have a little more feeling for situation gags, for personality gags, and who have a little showmanship in their system. They might develop into men who will be capable of carrying a story through to completion. Walt started to grapple with the technical problems of the feature he envisioned. Only the most caricatured of human figures had been portrayed in the Disney cartoons. More realistic drawings would be needed to establish the credibility of Snow White and the Prince. An attempt had been made in 1934's Silly Symphony, the goddess of spring, to portray Persephone as a realistic girl, a prototype for Snow White. The result was unconvincing, but Walt was not discouraged. We'll get it next time, he assured the animators. The solution he decided was to photograph a girl in action such as would be needed in the film. A young Los Angeles dancer, Marjorie Belker, known later as Marge Champion, was hired to walk and spin and dance before the camera, and her movements provided keys for the animators to follow. Another problem was the essential flatness of the animated film. Audience was accept the cavortings of two-dimensional pigs and wolves against painted backgrounds for an 8-minute span, but 80 minutes would emphasize the artifice of the animation process. The answer was the multiplane camera. It developed into a towering device with a camera pointed downward through 4 or 5 layers of paintings. The various levels depicted planes of vision, and the lens focus could be moved through the planes, creating the same effect of a moving camera in live action. Again, Walt used the Silly Symphony as a testing ground for the multiplane camera. It was first employed in the Old Mill. Walt described the short as just a poetic thing, nothing but music, no dialogue or anything. The setting of an old mill at sunset, the cows going home, and then what happens at the old mill at night. The spider coming out and weaving its web, the birds nesting, and then the storm coming up, an old mill going on a rampage. And with the morning, the cows come back, the spider web was all shattered and all that. It was just a poetic thing. The Old Mill was an exceptional success, winning critical praise and an Academy Award. It showed the Disney artist what could be accomplished in terms of mood and visual imagery. The work on characters and story for Snow White continued. Jumpy was renamed Sneezy, and the unnamed dwarf became a dim-witted mute. He was the last name to evolve. Walt advocated Dopey, but others objected that it sounded too modern and connoted narcotic addiction. Walt discovered that the word had appeared in Shakespeare, and he decreed that the seventh dwarf would be called Dopey. His clarity of vision can be seen by his comments in story conferences during the preparation of Snow White. Walt had prudently begun the practice of having a secretary make verbatim transcripts of the conferences. Snow White is visited in the cottage by the queen in her white witch's disguise. At the time the menace comes in, Snow White should be doing something that shows she's happy and that she's trying to do something nice for these little men. That's the time the menace should strike. It's most powerful when it strikes when people are most happy. It's dramatic. She's taken aback when she first sees the queen. She doesn't suspect the queen, but there's a lunatic around somewhere and he approaches you, but you have that funny feeling. It's nothing you could put a finger on. You wouldn't have the police come, but you'd be on your guard. That's the point we ought to bring out with the animals. They are dumb, but they have a certain sense, like a dog who knows that somebody is not a friend. When the bird sees the old witch, they know that everything is not right, and they're alarmed and back out of the way, retreat quietly. It has just dampened everything. But when the birds see the vultures that have followed her, that tells them something that even a human won't recognize. Conclusion. Fade in on her in the glass coffin, maybe shade by a big tree. It's built on sort of a little pedestal. Torches are burning, two dwarves on either side with things like guards would have. Others are coming up and putting flowers on the coffin. It's all decked with flowers. The birds fly up and drop flowers. Shots of the bird show them sad. Snow White is beautiful in the coffin. Then you hear the prince, the birds, dwarves, everyone hear him off screen. As they turn to look, here he is silhouetted against the hill with his horse. As he walks down the hill singing the song, cut to Snow White in the coffin. As he approaches, everyone sort of steps back as if he has a right there. He goes up to the coffin and finishes the song. As he finishes the song, he lifts the glass lid of the coffin, and maybe there's a hesitation. Then he kisses her. From the kiss, he drops down and buries his head in his hands in a sad position, and all of the dwarves see it, and every dwarf drops his head. All the animals are sad, but then Snow White begins to wake up like she's coming out of a sleep and begins to sit up. Nobody notices at first. One dwarf looks up and sees it, takes it, then several of them take it maybe. She sits up. The prince comes back and sees it. He springs to his feet. The music begins to pick up. The birds take it and go crazy. The dwarves go crazy, hug each other. As he carries her along, they are all happy, following along. The music gets bright. The birds and animals are cutting capers. Storymen and animators made contributions at the conferences, but it was always Walt's voice that dominated, suggesting camera angles, indicating moods, and, most valuable of all, acting out his concept of the dialogue in action. Sometimes he made contributions from his own experience. In 1936, he was invited to the annual encampment of the Bohemia Club, a San Francisco organization of artists and civic figures. The ritual consisted of wining, feasting, and camping out in a redwood grove north of San Francisco Bay. When Walt returned to the studio, he complained of being unable to sleep because of the symphony of snores in the nearby tents. He described and produced each of the snores to the hilarity of his storymen. The result was a snoring sequence in the dwarf's cottage. As always, Walt paid close attention to the music. Except for an abortive attempt at learning the violin as a boy, he had no real experience with music, yet he had an uncanny knack for picking music that would appeal to the public. He liked melody and he preferred music that wasn't too loud or too high pitched. Composers and arrangers learned not to use piccolos in Disney's score. Early attempts at Snow White songs did not please him. He complained that they follow the pattern of Hollywood musicals, which introduce songs and dances at regular intervals without regard to the progression of the story. We should set a new pattern, a new way to use music, he argued. Weave it into the story so somebody just doesn't burst into song. Nor was Walt satisfied with the voices that he auditioned for the role of Snow White. His office was connected to the soundstage by wire so he could listen to auditioning singers. None possessed the childlike quality Walt was seeking. One day, his talent man assured him that the next candidate would be perfect. She was a 14-year-old with a bell-like soprano. Walt listened and commented, "She's too mature. She sounds between 20 and 30. The girl was Deanna Durbin. Finally, Walt heard a voice that made him say, "That's the girl. That's Snow White." She was 18-year-old Adriana Casalati, who had been family trained in Italian opera. The small unit worked next to Walt's office was joined by other animators and background artists until the spring of 1936. The feature cartoon occupied the talents of virtually everyone in the studio. Making of the shorts continued since they sustained the flow of much needed cash, but the real sense of pioneering excitement centered on Snow White, and each breakthrough in technique and character delineation was greeted like a new weapon in a holy war. Walt was selecting his animators with the same thoughtful care that another film producer would exercise in shooting human actors for an all-star movie. Freddie Moore, Bill Teitla, Fred Spencer, and newcomer Frank Thomas proved to be the animators who could instill humor and individual characteristics in the dwarves. Norm Ferguson superbly limed the minutes of the witch. Ham Lusky accepted the formidable challenge of making Snow White move with human grace. Grim Natwick also contributed to Snow White and animated the prince, the least successful of the human figures. Snow White's animal friends were entrusted to three young artists, Milt Kahl, Eric Larson, and Jim Auger. All of the animators and the background artists, too, drew inspiration from the preliminary sketches of Albert Herder and Gustav Tingren, whose European origins and training helped provide the flavor and mood of a fairy tale. The controlling hand of Walt Disney followed every phase of production. He realized the need to test each sequence as it was developed, and the story sketches were filmed on a Leica reel, as the rough sequences had come to be called, so it could be judged before being committed to the final process of animation. These were viewed in the sweatbox by Walt, by supervising director Dave Hand, and by the individual sequence directors Bill Cottrell, Wilford Jackson, Ben Sharpstein, Larry Morey, and Pierce. Walt also looked at reels of rough animation, known as pencil tests. He screened preliminary footage for many of the creative workers, and they were asked to respond to such questions as, does any section seem too long or too short? Did any of the business strike you as being objectable? Were there any spots where the audience would laugh at the wrong time? Do you recall any gags where you thought the point was missed? Is the personality of each character consistent? As each sequence was approved for production, new ones were being prepared. Almost every working day through the last half of 1936 and into 1937, Walt held story conferences with members of the staff. A storyboard meeting on November 24th, 1936, concerned the scene of the wall preparing the poison apple. Walt: the thought just struck me on the build-up of the music to where she says, now turn red, etc. That where it starts, you might go into innocent, sweet music while she's saying something about how innocent it looks. The music changes if the apple changes and could stay that way until she says, have a bite. It would be a good contrast. Hand: you mean the innocence of the apple or of Snow White? Walt: the apple. You have seen the poison seeping into it and the build-up on the hocus pocus around it. Then some innocent little theme there could come back to the heavy music after she says, have a bite. Richard Reedon: admiring the apple as if she'd like to eat it herself. Pink as a maiden's blush. Walt: something to show how tempting the apple is, how tempting it would be to anybody she offered it to. Bill Cottrell: wouldn't you want that when you are back on her? She even goes sweet herself. She'd change her personality into the peddler woman, then look over the raven for her. Have a bite. Walt: it would be part of her sales talk here. The apple has just changed from this terrible thing in blowfly colors and the skull to a beautiful red. There wouldn't be too much of it, just enough for contrast. Ferguson: would it be too much of a burlesque on her if it went, she said, I'll be the fairest in the land? She started to be pretty up, fixing her hair. Walt: why not? She's clowning. Take that attitude with her. Walt's initial estimate of $500,000 for Snow White proved absurdly low. It was going to cost 3 times that amount. United Artists executives exhibited little enthusiasm for the project, and influential figures throughout the film industry doubted the wisdom of the Disney experiment with a feature cartoon. Walt learned that it was being called Disney's Folly, and there were predictions that Snow White would sink him into bankruptcy. He expressed his concerns about the negative publicity to Hal Horn, the exploitation manager of United Artists, who had first recognized the worth of the Three Little Pigs. Horn had become a good friend of the Disney studio, and Walt often sought his advice. What should I do about this bad talk about the feature? Walt asked. Nothing, Horn replied. Keep them wondering. Let them call it Disney's Folly or any other goddamn thing. As long as they keep talking about it, the picture is going to pay off, and the more suspense you build up, the more it'll pay off. Not all of the important people in the film industry lacked faith in Snow White. W.G. Van Schmus, who managed the nation's largest movie theater, the Radio City Music Hall, had long been friendly with the Disneys and paid the highest rental for the Mickeys and the Symphonies. Whenever he came to Hollywood, he paid a call to the Disney studio. Walt showed him the work in progress on Snow White, and Van Schmus was impressed. Walter, it'll be a success, he said. I'll book it for the music hall. Encouragement also came from Walter Wanger, a distinguished producer who played polo with Walt and Roy. Wanger assured Joseph Rosenberg, the Bank of America executive who supervised loans to Walt Disney Productions. Joe, if Walt does as well in the feature as he has done with everything else he's made, the public will buy it. Still, Rosenberg retained a banker's normal caution. When Roy asked for more money to complete Snow White, Rosenberg was reluctant. Roy advised Walt, "You gotta show Joe what you've done on the picture so far." "I can't do that," Walt insists. "All I've got is bits and pieces. I never like to show anybody a picture when it's all cut up. It's too dangerous." "Walt, you have to," Roy replied. "The only way we're going to get more money is to show them what they're lending money for." Walt grudgingly agreed. He ordered his staff to work overtime to prepare a presentation that contained the essential elements of Snow White. Since only a few of the sequences had been completed, the action had to be bridged by pencil sketches and rough layout. Excuse me. Only the two men were present in the projection room. The room darkened. On the screen came the scene of a fairy tale book opening. What followed was a jumble of fully animated sequences in color, alternating with long sketches of penciled long stretches of penciled sketches of static figures. The soundtrack was fragmentary, and Walt filled in the gaps with his own recital of the dialogue and action. Despite Walt's energetic performance, Rosenberg's response was only an occasional, "Yes, yes." Finally, the showing ended with Snow White and the prince living happily ever after. The lights came on in the projection room, and Walt searched the banker's face for a sign of approval. There was none. Walt followed him out the door, down the studio street, and into the alley where Rosenberg's car was parked. Rosenberg talked about Roy, the weather, anything except what he had just seen in the projection room. He climbed in the car, started the motor, and said, "Thanks, goodbye." Then he added, "That thing is going to make a hat full of money." With financing assured, production of Snow White accelerated. Artists worked uncomplainingly on Saturdays and Sundays, and at night, too. All were imbued with a crusade like mission to make the first feature cartoon a success. Only one negative note appeared. Among the written responses to a showing of a partly finished film was an anonymous "stick to shorts." Walt was upset for days. Years afterward, when an employee responded negatively to a Disney idea, he pointed a finger and exclaimed, "I'll bet you're the guy who wrote Stick to Shorts." As Snow White was being completed, the Disney came to the end of their association with United Artists. They had been dissatisfied with the distributor's terms, and the proposal for a new contract offered little improvement. United Artists insisted on the television rights to Disney cartoons, and Walt refused to part with them. "I don't know what television is, and I'm not going to sign away anything I don't know about," he reasoned. RKO offered much more favorable terms, and the Disney signed a releasing agreement for the shorts and for Snow White. The studio was racing for a Christmas release of Snow White, but when Walt reviewed a nearly completed version of the film, he noticed something disturbing. When the prince leaned over to kiss Snow White in her glass coffin, he shimmied. Something had gone wrong in the camera work or the animation. "I want to make it over," Walt announced to Roy. "How much will it cost?" Roy asked. Walt replied that it would require several $1,000s. "Forget it," said Roy, who had borrowed all he could. "Let the prince shimmy," and ever afterwards he did. The sales force of RKO began discussions on how to sell the film. One of the distribution executives told Walt, "We've got to play down the fairy tale angle." When Alt West asked why, the man replied, "Because audiences don't buy fairy tales. We've got to sell it as a romance between the prince and Snow White and play down the dwarves. We can call it simply Snow White." "No, it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarves," Walt insisted. "It's a fairy tale. That's what I put $1.5 million into, and that's the way it's going to be sold." Finally, on December 21st, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was seen by the public in a glittering premiere at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. The great names of Hollywood and the leaders of the film industry stepped out of their limousines to praise Walt Disney on the radio. Inside the Carthay Circle, they laughed at the floppy antics of Dopey, and some cried when the dwarfs found Snow White in a death-like sleep. When the movie ended, the audience stood and cheered. Many years later, Walt reminisced in wonderment. All the Hollywood brass turned out for my cartoon. That was the thing. And it went back to when I first came out here and went to my first premiere. I'd never seen one in my life. I saw all these Hollywood celebrities coming in and just had a funny feeling. I had just hoped that someday they'd go into a premiere of a cartoon because people would appreciate the cartoon. They'd kind of look down. I met a guy on a train when I was coming out. It was one of those things that kind of made you mad. I was out on the back platform. I was in my pants and coat that didn't match, but I was riding first class. I was making conversation with a guy who asked me, "Going to California?" "Yeah, I'm going out there." "What business you in?" I said, "The motion picture business." Then all of a sudden, "Oh, is that right? Well, I know somebody in the picture business. What do you do?" I said, "I make animated cartoons." Oh, it was like saying, "I sweep up the latrines." Sometimes people make you mad. You want to prove something to them, even though they mean nothing to you. I thought of that guy on that back platform when we had the premiere of Snow White, and the darn thing went out and grossed $8 million around the world. Thank you again for coming to today's presentation of Walt Disney, an American Original. Look forward to being with you guys next week as we continue the story. And remember, today's special moments are tomorrow's memories. Have a good day.